Now, some people say that business is not all about the numbers, and I absolutely disagree. And I'll explain in today's episode why I disagree. Plus, we're going to talk about a few key subjects that are popping up in the news and why that relates to your business and the stuff your accountant just isn't telling you. So stay tuned for today's episode.
Welcome to the podcast where we tell small business owners how to use the secrets and strategies that big businesses use to increase their profitability.
So welcome back to the show. Lola, welcome back. It's been a little while since we filmed another episode.
It has been a little while since we filmed another episode together. I have been holding down the fort while Terrell was traveling and being a world speaker, speaking on different world stages. So you know what, Terrell? The audience is happy to have you back. So insert little applause here. Welcome back, Terrell. Welcome back.
It is good to be back. I will say, taking some time off for the vacation that we took in Greece, which was amazing.
Phenomenal.
The photos that we took, just being able to relax. Now, we ended up doing some work while we were on vacation, but I don't feel like it took away from the vacation. I feel like I still got to enjoy the vacation.
I would agree. And I think because of how we structured the vacation. So for those of you that haven't listened to the last couple episodes I did, we took a cruise. And I think what I really liked about it, Terrell, was the fact that this cruise was 7 days, right? We flew into Athens a couple of days before the cruise. We flew in, I think, on a Friday. The cruise was on a Sunday. So I really liked the fact that I think the way that it was structured is while we were sailing, we kind of got to work, and then during the day we could get off the ship, do some of the excursions or some of the activities, get back, and just really there was so much flexibility in what we could do. So I really like that.
Absolutely. I mean, and there were just amazing activities that we could do. I mean, I'm thinking about maybe, and I'm going to talk to some friends because during this time of being off, it gave me time to really think strategically about some of the new projects, and we got a lot of clarity about some new projects, and there are some really cool stuff underway. Some major projects we're thinking about. We're going to do a lot more traveling, working on some stuff of potentially doing some filming projects in Hawaii, and there are going to be some really cool trips coming up that I'm excited about. And then, like I said, speaking on different stages. But one of the things that I think that was really, really good is taking the time to really lay out what's the storyline for this podcast, the content that we're creating, because I think that's something that we probably didn't lay out as clearly. But as you and I both know from marketing and branding and all that stuff, it's like people want to know what's the storyline. Like earlier today, we were sitting and we were trying to find a show or a movie to watch. And I would say, how many movies did we go? I mean, it's like, how many movies did we watch? How many previews did we watch where we were just like, I still don't know what's going on?
Quite a few. There's probably like 6 or 7 trailers. We were like, yeah, no, I don't know. We even watched like two episodes of another show that we followed season 1, and we followed those episodes, and they were we were confused in season 1. I thought that was like the extent of confusion we could get to, but then season 2 came out on Prime Video, and I was like, what the heck is this? We're 2 episodes in, and we still have not figured out what is happening in the show, who is the villain. And no, I definitely think it's very connected to what we're talking about today. And even just the need in marketing and branding to be able to have a very clear story and a very clear idea of who is the bad guy, what is the objective, what problems are you trying to solve, and being able to communicate that clearly to your audience.
Absolutely. And whenever that's missing in any storyline, I mean, just people lose interest. And so wanted to really clarify when it comes down to this show and the content that we are creating, like the brand company is the Business Talk Library. So the Business Talk Library has different shows for different audiences. So our goal is after, 3 years of just filming content and really doing over 600 interviews with business owners and really understanding like what were some of the problems that they were having, what was their experience like, we recognize that there were some very consistent problems that business owners are struggling with. And I mean, the whole picture is they're struggling to build profitable and successful businesses that they enjoy. Now,
Mhm.
two really, really big reasons why is because one is there's a ton of bad advice out there. And then
Part
number two is that things have just gotten way more complicated than they need to be. And a lot of that is because there are some, I guess you would say business gurus out there or business coaches or consultants who have just really overcomplicated things so much that people just aren't making the type of progress that they should be making. And one of the things that I'm just like, you know what? I really want to target attacking that problem. Like, people who make it more complicated and more complex, and the people who put out bad advice, those are the enemy. That's the bad guy in our story because the audience that listens to our show, they're the heroes of the storyline. We're just here to help them overcome the bad advice and these bad gurus. So, that's what the storyline is. So when people tune in, they can know that, hey, this show is to help you overcome those bad so called business gurus or those social media experts, and also to overcome the complexity of just bad advice. And so that's what we're really going to be focused on. And the cool way that we're going to do it is we're going to take everyday, like very current stories, because in doing a lot of the traveling we've been doing over the past couple months and speaking on multiple stages and talking with multiple audiences, it's the stories in the everyday life and how we relate
Mhm.
a business concept to that story is what really allows people to connect with it. So that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be looking at top stories and we're going to be connecting the business lesson in those top stories. Now, some of them may throw you for a loop because when you hear them, you'll be like, how in the world is that related to business? But we're going to make it work.
And I think the great thing about Terrell is for those of you that may have not seen his reels and some of the stuff we've done as we've traveled, Terrell is exceptionally talented at being able to make connections between random stuff that you don't even think about. And there's always a connection back to the business side. So I'm excited about this because I think some of the stuff that's resonated the most with our audience have been discussions and connections that we've made back to relevant or trending topics. And I think the reason for that is because at the core of it, people are dealing with problems every day and questions that they need to answer. And so I think just meeting them at where they are with some of the current things going on, inflation or whatever it is that's in the business news. But I think ultimately, Terrell, you hit the nail on the head when you said that I think that people make things more complex than they need to be. And I think part of the reason, and we've talked about this personally off the podcast, is because if it's not complex, why would you pay me to do it? Right? Is the idea in people's minds. So they're like, if I make this more complicated than you need to, then maybe you'll purchase my product. Like I was looking at something on Twitter recently of this lady that was she made a video and she said, you know what? It's basically a scam that optometrists are saying that you need glasses because you don't really need glasses. And these are the 5 things that I'm going to show you. And, to show you that you don't need glasses and you can basically heal your eyes, buy this for $10 and join my webinar. And it's like, and the optometrist is responding to it. And he's like, this is really bad information. First of all, you're generalizing. You don't understand people's situation. And you're basically creating a problem that doesn't exist to have to then force people to buy it, because the problem is essentially in this case, well, your optometrists have been lying to you this whole time. Now I'm trying to get you to buy this product of that I'm selling online. And it's like there's no scientific basis, there's no grounded basis behind what you're saying. And all of this is on social media. So can you imagine when it comes to accounting and finance, where people are literally giving out tons of bad advice online about running their businesses? So I just thought that was so timely for what we're going to talk about today.
No, I mean,
So
I think
bad.
it is so true. So let's get started with topic number one. Now, topic number one is probably something that a lot of people can already, kind of see the connection. But I want to talk about a little bit in more detail of just kind of what are some of the specifics around it. So, the economy. There is a
Mm,
lot of, things going on in the economy where there are some that are saying, "Hey, we're headed for a recession." Some are saying we're already in a recession, and all these trade agreements or
yeah.
inflation, and there's so many different topics. And to be honest with you, after spending, years of working for Fortune 500 companies where I spend a lot of time on the phone with Wall Street analysts and we're talking to institutional investors. And what I realize is a lot of the way that news media talks about, those kind of topics, they're very, very, very high level. So
That
the
is it. Yep.
individual business owner or the accountants who are working with individual business owners, it's very difficult for them to say, okay, all right, how can I take what I'm hearing at this very high level and then make it make sense for the people that we're dealing with? So I
Yep.
wanted to narrow in on, there was one article that I saw about, Kroger. And if depending on where you are in the country, you may be familiar with it or you may not be. Well, Kroger is a grocery store chain. And one of the things that it was talking about is Kroger had missed its sales projections for the quarter. And part of the reason they said is because, hey, inflation is coming down. And so some people are thinking about that, like, okay, all right, well, if inflation is coming down, isn't that good? Why did Kroger miss its sales targets? And part of the story there is that, well, when inflation was high, meaning people were paying more for the same stuff that they used to buy before. So if people are paying more money, now your top line number, sales or your revenue is going to be higher. And
Right.
so when you're looking at that, there are a lot of businesses that may be looking around and seeing like, hey, our sales have been up for the past year or whatever. We've been raising prices and we've been doing better. But what most companies didn't really take a step back and say, okay, all right, your sales might be up, but what does your bottom line look like? Like, what does
Exactly.
profitability look like? And that's one of the first things that I start asking about is like, your top line is that's before all of your vendors, that's before everybody else gets paid. But how much of that money are you actually keeping? So, I
Mm.
mean, I guess when you hear the topics about inflation and how people talk about inflation, what's some of the things that come to mind for you?
I think the first thing that comes to my mind, Terrell, is what you mentioned earlier, where that, the news, when the news discusses inflation, it's very high level. And I think episode 56 is an episode that I did a couple of weeks ago. So if you want to go back and refer back to that, and it was like 5 KPIs you should be watching instead of inflation. Because I think for business owners, you have a high level information in the news that says, okay, prices are going up. Okay, as a business owner, what do you do? How quickly is your industry being impacted by this, right? Because it varies, right? Depending on the industry that you're in and depending on the industry that you're serving. So I think for me, the first thing that I think about is it's too generic. So you really need to understand how it specifically impacts your business. And I think the example that you gave about prices are going up, but my bottom line isn't really changing, or my bottom line is actually worse, than being able to assess what is going on. And I think one of the things that I gave in the episode that I did on episode 56 was looking at your gross profit margin percentage, because like you said,
Mhm.
I think business owners will typically look at their revenue and be like, well, my revenue's up, I'm making more money, great, but is your margin lower than it has been last year, because now it's actually costing you more money because of inflation to buy these products that you need or to pay for these services that you need that ultimately help you support providing either a product or a service to your customers. So I think really getting down to the granularity of things and asking those specific questions, it's really what's going to help you take the information that's been given at a macro level and really see at micro, how does that impact your business? When you, Terrell, when you think, I'm curious, when you have been having conversations with some of our clients, and what has been kind of their bigger concerns on inflation, or just, I guess, deciding and trying to figure out how to make decisions in their business based on what they're hearing?
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing though, because inflation is always talked about at such a high level. Most people
Right.
just they haven't been able to conceptualize like what this actually means for them and their business.
Exactly.
because they're
Mhm.
like, hey, yeah, they're talking about, hey, the economy is heating up or the economy is cooling down. And they're like, that's so like high level and so, 10,000 foot level that I maybe I understand what that means for the country as a whole, but what does that mean for my individual business? So, I mean,
Mhm.
I think a lot of people just don't have enough of the context about it. And so when we start talking about things like that, like, we start trying to break it down, like you said, what that means for their business. So, like, if inflation is increasing, it's just like, all right, that means the price of things are growing at whatever the rate is. So
Right.
let's say if inflation's at 5%, that means the price that people are paying for stuff is growing by 5%. And so I talk to some of our clients. So let's think about your customers. If they're having to pay 5% more for stuff that they need in their everyday life, how much money does that leave for them to do business with you? And that's where they start to see, like, oh, that's how inflation impacts me. And I think that's where you really have to get, smart as a business owner. You start thinking, like, okay, all right, if the price of everything is going up, eventually your customers are going to start making decisions and saying, like, okay, all right, we
Exactly.
got to cut back on something because we
Exactly.
can't keep just paying more for everything. And when you start looking at that, I tell business owners, like, take a step back and just ask yourself, how important is your product or your service to the customers that you're dealing with? Because typically, when the economy starts eating, and when people's wallets or when money gets tighter, people they start looking at, hey, what expenses can I cut back on, or what services can I cut off? And so you got to ask yourself, like, based on what I do for my clients, like, how important is this to them? Because if they need to cut some expenses out of their budget, is what I do for them, is that going to be one of the first things that gets cut?
Yeah, that's really good. I think that's a really good point. And one of the things that I think also that's a good point, because one of the things that I think is also important is how do you show that you are a service or a product that is worth preserving for your client or your customer, right? People pay for things that they find valuable or things that they feel like they can't, for lack of a better word, live without. And so I think another thing is also understanding is as situations like these are happening, where you have situations where inflation is getting higher, how do you in your specific industry make sure that you're positioning your product and your service in a way where the client feels like, you know what, if I'm going to cut something, it's not going to be this, right? How do I cut other things to accommodate this because I know that the prices are going down? So I think that's a really good point. Another thing I think, Terrell, that I have seen has been, the adjustment on customers deciding, or like some of our customers or just business owners in general deciding whether or not they should increase prices. And I think the idea of people are like, okay, inflation is happening, we need to increase our prices. Not all industries and or clients have an appetite for price increases, right? So, especially if you are in an industry that maybe sees like a later impact on inflation, where you have a big lag on when the prices go up and kind of when you see the impact on your products or what you're buying, then it's probably not the best time to go ahead and do a 5% increase and chase all your clients away. So I think that's important to understand also, is just, okay, if I'm going to increase my prices, how do I position this? Does it make sense, or am I just doing it because I'm just trying to protect and insulate my business, but I really have no idea of what the impact itself is? Because you can increase prices by 1%, but let's say your product prices are going up by 2%, right? It's only going to partially cover it. So you really need to understand it. And I think the 5 KPIs I mentioned in episode 56 are important, to kind of give you that guidance to really say, how does this specifically apply to my business and to my industry?
Yeah, and I think a very overarching, kind of thing that I always tell people to think about is, why does your client value what they're getting from you? Like, how much
Mhm.
value do they place on it? And if you're looking to increase pricing, then the question you got to ask yourself is, all right, I know I may be increasing my price to keep up because of inflation and costs, but my customers don't look at it that way all the time. My
Right.
customer, if I'm they're gonna pay more, my customer kind of wants to understand, well, what else am I getting? Are you just going to tell me I need to pay the same price for the same level of service, or in some
Right.
cases for less service? And so, one of the, well, several of the talks that I've done at different conferences, and people were just like, oh my gosh, that's so, revolutionary for where they were at. And I was like, okay, here's what I would suggest doing is whatever you think your selling point is for your product or your service, take a step back and ask yourself, what problem is this solving for my client? Now, if you need to increase your pricing, what you probably should do is sit back and say, okay, all right, what is my client's problem that we're solving? How has that problem either grown or changed over time? So when you go back to them and you explain to them about the price increase, you're not going to them saying, well, hey, my costs have gone up, so I need to make you pay more. You can come back to them and
Right.
say, hey, here's how we're adjusting our product or our service to meet your current needs. And in order for us to meet your needs at this new level, here's what we're proposing for the pricing increase. Because I think what it does is it helps your clients start to understand that, hey, you're not just, increasing price because you want them to pay more. You're increasing price because you recognize that you are delivering value to them, and the price that they're paying is connected to the value that they're getting from it. Because, like I said, when people are looking at what costs they want to cut, if they don't necessarily connect the dots between your price and the value they get, your product or your service is going to be one of the first ones that they cut.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point, and I like a point that you made, when we were having a conversation a couple of weeks ago, which was oftentimes for business owners, there's a disconnect between where we feel like the value that we feel like our client should get from what we're doing and the value that they actually get. And that tends to vary, especially for service-based businesses. Sometimes it varies from person or from business to business, right? So for one client, I'll speak specifically for our accounting firm, what one law firm may desperately need in their business may be different from what another law firm may desperately need, or what they define and how they define value. And so sometimes I think that if you come into a space and you're like, well, this is what they're getting and this is what I think they define as value, sometimes you make the mistake of missing that misalignment the alignment you talked about, Terrell. It causes a misalignment, and then people don't really see that product as being valuable. Any other thoughts on that point?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we've definitely hit that one very well. So, I would like to move to the next one because this one I thought was very interesting. Because when I saw it, and even when I told you about it, you were like, why are we talking about this? I'm like, okay, follow me.
I mean,
There's a
let's
story to
provide
hear.
context. Let's provide context. I was like, I think this is an interesting one. But like I said, you have a phenomenal gift of being able to make the connection. And I saw the connection when you explained it. So I think the audience
Yeah.
will as
So
well. So let's
so
jump
so
in.
here's the thing. Beyonce is on an amazing tour. And if you go on depending on what your connections look like on social media, you'll see people are attending the Beyonce concert. Now, right before one of her recent concerts, I think it was the one on September 4th, she made an announcement on her website of a preference that she had. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is an amazing business concept because for this September 4th concert, she wanted people to come dressed in silver. And I was like, oh my gosh, like this
I
is
think it was her
amazing.
birthday concert or something like that. Yeah.
And I was like, there's an amazing business lesson here because when you dug a little bit deeper, what you started realizing is small business owners, people that were on Etsy or people that were reselling stuff, people who
Listen.
had silver in their inventory, meaning they had silver shirts or silver skirts. Some people were going out making stuff. I mean, they were going to
Listen.
dollar stores and making outfits, or they were going to this store. Like people who had silver in their inventory, or people who went and found some silver stuff, they were selling like crazy. And the concept that I was like, you know what? For some reason, when we're building businesses, and this is something that most accountants don't really talk to their clients about, because whenever a client is, let's say, a client's going through a tough time, or a client's trying to figure out some things, trying to increase profitability, the first thing accountants try to tell them, hey, we need to cut back on this cost,
Reduce
cut back on
cost.
this cost. And I'm like, I mean, there's only so much. I mean, you can't cut your costs. And I guess let me put it the way. You can only cut so much. Like
Correct.
I mean, you're going to get to a point where you're just like, you're down to the bare essentials. When I'm like, a better strategy would be is, how do we get more strategic about where we're spending money? And then how do we grow the revenue? And so with this, all of those business owners that went out and started buying silver stuff, some of them started making stuff. I mean, they were using Facebook Marketplace. They were using all the Etsy, all these different platforms.
Listen,
And I'm just like, you know what? We need to bring that type of hustle back, where
right.
people are paying attention to current events and figuring out, how do I leverage this current event to move my business forward? And when I saw that, I was like, okay, all right, we got to talk about that on the show.
That's really good. And I think it's also the idea that nothing is beneath you, because if I had a business, I guess a clothing line, and I was selling on Etsy, what I would have done is I would have gone to all of the thrift stores in my neighborhood and I would have bought a bunch of that silver stuff, because I think like the trend that I've seen in some of the photos from the Beyonce concert, it's been like this disco theme, like 80s kind of feel. There are a bunch of stuff at the thrift store that people have donated that I bet you can find. And I think sometimes we as business owners, or sometimes as business owners, sometimes you feel like, man, like that's kind of beneath me. Like I'm past that point. But I don't think you're ever past the point to hustle, especially if you know a situation where revenue is a problem. And I love how you say this, just you need to get scrappy. You need to find other avenues to make money, because money is money, and it might come from a source where you're like, well, I usually don't have revenue coming from here, or this is an alternate source. But the reality is you have to find opportunities to continue to bring in more revenue in your business. And I think this was a really good indication that the business owners that were able to respond quickly, I think that was also a good thing. The business owners that were kind of thinking on their feet and thinking about, okay, how do I modify what I'm offering, especially if I'm in the clothing industry, to be able to meet this need, because I know there's going to be a demand. So capitalizing on the trends. And I think the people that are able to do that do so well, because not everything, of course, is going to be related to your industry. But if you can kind of watch and understand and see, okay, what's going on? How does this impact me? And how do we go from there? It definitely makes a big difference.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that that's something that, you really have to kind of build this environment that where you encourage yourself to keep that little bit of scrappiness about you. Because even
Mhm.
as I've been traveling around and talking with leaders from, multi-million dollar and some billion-dollar companies, and they're struggling with the same thing. Like, they're facing some of the same struggles. And what has happened is their company has gotten so big that they've just lost that sense of being able to assess, hey, what's going on in the market? What's going on with customer interest? What's going on with this? And since they don't really have a pulse on what's happening, they're not able to really adapt and come up with new things. Like, another example is when it comes down to AI and technology. Like, there are so many people who are afraid of AI and technology. Like, well, it's going to ruin this industry. It's going to ruin this. And I'm just like, not if you're willing to adapt and leverage it. I mean,
Agreed.
and
Yeah.
that's really what you got to do as a business, because like I said, there's only so much cost you can cut. Eventually, you
Right.
have to learn how to adapt so you can grow. And like, even if, let's say, for example, you didn't have anything silver to sell. Like, there were people that I saw that were doing some very creative stuff. Like, I remember when the Beyonce concert series first got announced, and I saw this realtor make this post about, hey, if you need help selling your house so you can afford your Beyonce tickets, give me a call.
I bet you that's pretty catchy. If somebody like you remember that, somebody else would remember that. I think that's actually really neat. Yeah.
And I'm sure that realtor phone had like more people are aware of who that realtor is because
Exactly.
like just leveraging things that are going on, and it's just like, hey, how do I leverage this very popular situation that's happening, and how do I kind of tie this back to what I'm doing, whether it's a joke or whether it's something very straightforward like selling silver products on your Etsy account, or whether it's just leveraging the momentum of that trending topic and say, hey, how do I use that? I mean, because a lot of times you're going to get a lot of free publicity. Like, to get the amount of publicity that we've gotten from just leveraging trending topics, it would have cost us probably, over $100,000 in marketing and advertising. But because
Right.
we were able to leverage, situations that were going on, we saved ourselves, over $100,000, and have still been able to grow the revenue and the profitability of our business because we just allowed ourselves to think outside the box.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I think an advantage that small to medium-sized businesses need to remember and realize that they have, and I did another episode on this, I think it's like episode 55, is the fact that the ability, like, for example, when we saw that article on the Beyonce situation, it didn't talk about H&M, it didn't talk about Zara, it talked about the Etsy sellers, it talked about the people that were on Facebook Market, which means that the smaller you are, the more scrappy you can get and the quicker you can respond to trends. A lot of these big businesses, the hierarchies, you got to get the ad approved, you got to get the launch approved. There's so much red tape the bigger the company grows, I think, especially for public companies, where it becomes harder for them to respond quickly to these kind of things. But if you are a small to medium sized business, you can respond a lot quicker, which means that you have less competition in that space. And so I think when you think about it like that, is you have an advantage. I think that's one. And then I think even just the idea of, like, for example, the idea of the realtor that you gave, of just being creative, of instead of spending time, because I think we're kind of in a society now where a lot of people will try to spend time, like, regardless of your feelings about Beyonce or not, like, people will spend time focusing on how they feel about the situation instead of trying to understand, like, how do I capitalize this? Put your feelings aside and think about what's happening right now. How can I capitalize this? And how can I drive my business forward, leveraging what's happening currently?
Yeah, I mean, and I call it, it's kind of like that when we travel to different countries, and a lot of times I call them the street hustlers, and I love
Yeah.
watching
Oh,
them
yeah.
work because especially the ones that often sell water. Like, if you're going to a major event and it's hot outside, the closer you get to the entrance, the more like you'll see the prices of the bottle of water go up. And where this person may have just had cases of water and selling $1 a case, well, this person went out and they bought a cooler and they put it on ice. So now they're selling it for $1.50. And what you start to notice is like, man, these people are understanding what's going on in the situation. They're assessing what's happening, and they're really coming up with something that's very relevant. And so I definitely think that, across the board, I mean, the big thing that I took away from that was, there are so many opportunities. Like, yes, the economy, maybe people may have some concerns about the economy and maybe trying to figure out, hey, how do I start, rationing my spending, or how do I start cutting back on some things? So here's a very practical piece of advice that I've given a lot of business owners. If we talked about it, like, if you know that, hey, your potential customers are looking for ways of saving or cutting back on costs, is then why not just come up with a base level and a premium version of your product or your service and say, like, hey, if they want to cut costs, then we have a base level version of our service or our product that they can get. Now, if they want the premium version, like, hey, they can buy the premium version. Because what I have seen is a lot of businesses who use that strategy have been able to really capitalize. And I know, like, for us, and having an accounting firm, we do a lot of bookkeeping and CFO work. There are some people who weren't quite ready for the CFO services. So one of the things we came up with is like, hey, we have a CFO reporting service that we can offer where you're not going to get all the one-on-one meetings like the premium level service. But what we will do is we'll design the dashboards, we'll manage the regular reporting, we'll make sure you get that reporting on a regular basis. And then if you need to have a meeting, we can set up and that can be an a la carte thing. And then there were some where like, nah, we want to have a standing meeting on the calendar. Well, they pay the premium price. And by being able to split that out that way, we were able to grow the business's revenue. Plus, we were able to save on costs because we started leveraging technology to be able to automate the base level version. And then we can afford to offer the premium because people are paying a premium price. And I think we got to get scrappy and think outside of the box when it's your business, when it comes down to that.
I fully agree. I think that's such a good point, and I think it's so important because I think people sometimes have an all or nothing approach, and it doesn't have to be all or nothing. While you might not fully support, um, be able to fully support, like you said, the business owner because maybe they can't afford a specific service, but maybe you provide a modified option that allows them to still be able to get some sort of value from it, but it's just at a reduced price, and it's adjusted based on what they can afford. So yeah, that's a good point. What else we got?
Absolutely. So the next thing is earning season. So we're in September. So for most people who have a calendar year end, meaning like their last day of their financial year or fiscal year is December 31st. Now, for people that are in that situation, the end of September is the end of the third quarter, which means right now we're in early September. So a lot of companies are trying to push to really end September off on a really, really good note. Because what we
Listen.
do start to think about is depending on what type of business, like, you know, people want to know, okay, how did you end the third quarter? And then what do you think your fourth quarter is going to look like? Now, for a lot
Right.
of businesses, the fourth quarter is filled with a lot of holidays. I mean, for depending on like, which holidays people, celebrate, there's a lot of them that are packed into the fourth quarter. Like when you
Mhm.
think about, late October, you think about November, you think about December, there's a lot of holidays, a lot of downtime that businesses have. And so people really want to know, like, if you had a bad third quarter, you're probably not going to be doing that great in the fourth quarter, is what some people are anticipating. And so, this is a time that I tell people it's a great time for you to really take inventory on how have you done thus far this year, and then hey, start planning for what is the future going to look like in your business. So, I guess Lola, around this time of year, for the companies that you've worked with and worked for, has this been like the common time for like planning for what comes ahead?
Yes, it definitely has. And I'm sure at every company in corporate America, people say this is the most important quarter of our lives. This is the most important quarter ever. There is an executive in a room saying this is the most important quarter of our life. And I think for a couple of reasons. One, because you said you hit it right. You made your point right very clearly is 3Q is going to be an indication of how your fourth quarter is going to be because like you said, there's so many holidays, so much activity. This is also a time where people start to think about 2024, or in this case, because this episode is evergreen, whatever the next year is. And I think it's a good evaluation to say where you ended for the third quarter. And it's usually about 8 months into the year is when they kind of start thinking about next year's. How you performed in the third quarter is really kind of going to be a baseline to say, okay, based on where we are year to date, what do we think is going to happen next year? What are we going to do differently? How are we going to run the business? Because you don't really want to be making this plan on January 1st, right? And I think for small to medium sized business owners, if the holidays are typically going to take time away from, or, maybe you're going to take some time off, your employees are going to take some time off, you want to start having those conversations now when people aren't distracted. And I think it's a good time to really start to kind of re engage the team on what they're looking for and what comes. But I am curious from a business owner standpoint, because I'm very familiar with it from a corporate standpoint. I know kind of the process and the rhythm. You are familiar with it on both ends. You're familiar with it on kind of thinking about it as running a business, but you also worked in investor relations and you saw kind of the churn that came with announcing results. You saw kind of how it worked in corporate America. So I'm curious to see from a business owner standpoint and someone who's been a business owner, who is a business owner, do you think that there is a different mindset that's required for business owners versus maybe what you saw in corporate America to really be in the right mindset for Q4, but also in planning for the rest of, I guess, in planning for the next year, or in this case, 2024?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the business owner, I think the mindset you got to be in is you got to start thinking ahead. And when I was in corporate, I'll be honest with you, like I knew the fourth quarter was coming, we were aware, but I wasn't really thinking about, what that actually meant for the business. I mean, to be
Mm,
honest with you, I mean, when I was working in corporate, a lot of times I was thinking about my own holiday that was coming up,
right.
days that I wanted to take off. But when you're the business owner, one of the things you
Right.
have to think about is like, okay, all right, my customers, their attention is going to be a little diverted. My staff, if you have employees and staff members, hey, their attention is going to be a little diverted. So, like the first thing, like with the customers, I need to understand what are the buying habits of my customers. So, one of the exercises we've been going through with a lot of our clients is just looking and seeing, like, hey, what are the buying habits and the patterns? Is this a time of year where things get slow, or is your type of business one where things actually start to pick up during this time? If things are going to pick up during this time, now let's look. Will you have the staffing and the resources to support that? Because if you don't have the staff and you're having more customers who want your service or your product, you might not be able to deliver that because you're not in position for that. And so I do think, as a business owner, you got to think about your clients' buying habits. And then you also have to think about your internal processes. Like, are you prepared to handle whatever the surge or the downturn may be during this time of year? And I'll be honest, that just wasn't where my mind was at when I was an employee.
That's a really, really good point. I think that is such an important distinguishing mindset, because you're almost having to kind of look at all, like, and I don't know how to play chess, but look at the chessboard and figure out what are the moving pieces and how do you make sure that as a business owner, none of those are like colliding and kind of not working against or working against each other. Because, like you mentioned, your employees are planning their own holidays and they're trying to take time off. Your clients are probably going to be distracted with other things. So, how do you make sure you're better supporting them? People also tend to, I don't want to say this kind of, I don't want to be too like generic, but I think sometimes people like to start things for the first time in the beginning of the year. So that might make it a little bit more difficult to acquire new clients as well. So there's all of these things that you need to take into account and factor. So I think that's a really good point, and really good perspective. Anything that you feel like would be good that you also want to highlight, maybe on top of what we've shared, to
Yeah,
the
I
to
mean, I
the
think that
audience?
I think, Q3 is a very important time. Not so much just, hey, just getting the results for September, but I think also kind of setting the expectation for Q4. Like, for example, like with our staff, one of the things we've been doing this month is we've been really, really making the processes of getting the work done very, very clear, because we know there are going to be more people that take time off in the month of December. Well, while this person is taking time off, we need to make sure the process is clear enough so that
Mhm.
somebody else on the team can step in and fill that gap. And so I
Right.
think that Q3 is a perfect time to make sure your core processes are in place. So, one is you finish Q3 strong, but you go into Q4 with a lot more clarity, because a lot of people are going to be taking time off, and you don't want to have to go back to your clients and be like, well, it's the holiday season, so we're going to miss all our deadlines. Like, no, you want clear processes in place so that things can keep happening. Because I will say is, if you can deliver to your clients well during fourth quarter, it makes it a lot easier for you to win new business going into the beginning of the year. Because
Yeah.
a lot out of all the 600 plus interviews, one of the common complaints that I heard a lot is that when we get closer to the end of the year, the companies that I'm doing business with, they kind of forget about me. And I'm like, that is a
Mm,
perfect time for you to really shine in your customers' eyes so you can
that's a
win
good
new
point.
business, because we've won a lot of new business going into January just because
Oh.
we showed up more and we delivered more in Q4. And I think that a lot of businesses miss that opportunity.
Ooh, that's really good. I think it's just capitalizing on other people's slacker behavior. Just And I mean, I don't think we're perfect at this, but we're learning, and we have a really great leader here at the TL Turner Group, Terrell Turner, who ensures we have some pretty solid processes to ensure that we continue to deliver. But I think that is really such a good point, because I know a lot of the conversations you've been having with people, I think we've closed quite a few deals. Like, even if I think about last year, like we closed quite a few deals in the fourth quarter with just law firms where people were like, okay, it's the end of the year and I still don't have my financials from last year, or they're a hot mess.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know what I've done, and I don't know how my business has done for the entire year, because I still haven't gotten anything from my accountant. And we're just like, oh my
Yeah.
gosh, like that is a problem. And so I think that is a really good point, capitalizing on the gaps that your competition may have, and using that as an opportunity to really be able to acquire new business. That's a really good point.
Absolutely. We're gonna talk about that a little bit more on the last one. But
Yeah.
before we wrap up for today, I did want to go back to the key point, a main topic that I brought up in the intro. And this is what I would call the bad advice section. Because I hear a lot of people saying, like, hey, well, I really love my business isn't all about the numbers. And I was listening to this talk on YouTube, and someone was up speaking, and they were asking the speaker a question, and they were just like, I just want to say thank you because you gave me permission to recognize that, the business isn't all about the numbers. And I was just like, that's actually pretty bad advice. Because I'm just
That
like,
is bad advice.
business is always about the numbers. Now, here's the caveat that I would say is business is always about the numbers. But I'm like, as the business owner or the business leader, you get to decide which numbers the business will be about. So when I say business is always about the numbers, it's not that, hey, business is always about the revenue and the net income. Those are just some numbers. Your
Right.
business could be about the number of people that you help. It could be about the number of customers that you have, or it could be about the number of employees. It could be about the number of vacation days that you're able to enjoy because you've created a business that runs itself. I'm like, at
Right.
the end of the day, if you don't have numbers to really measure things, then you won't know if you're being successful or not. I mean, and so a lot of times when I hear people say, well, the business isn't all about the numbers, then I'm just like, well, then how are you going to know if you're successful or not? Like,
That is
you
true.
need something to measure it. And so that is why I think, I will identify when people say, oh, business isn't all about the numbers, as very bad advice for anyone who's trying to lead or run a business. I would say business is always about the numbers. It's just you get to decide which numbers you're going to place importance on. And if you don't have numbers that you're placing importance on, then the question I would have to ask, and you should ask yourself, is what are we doing here? How are we going to
Why are we
know or
here?
measure if we're successful if we're not focused on the numbers? So, thanks for tuning in for today's episode. Until next time.